Anyway, how's your lumbago today?
Fine.
Is it?
Yeah.
Good, because
you
told me it was recurring. What about the arthritis?
That's manageable.
I mean, let's face it, none of us is getting any younger. Yet millions of us don't have a pension. I sound like one of those daytime TV adverts now, like Michael Parkinson. So you can't get coverage cheaper than that. Anyway, the number of people actively paying into a workplace pension scheme has dropped consistently in recent years. It used to be a hallmark of Britain that we had these private pension schemes. Now, a little more than 8 million. There are about 25 million people in the private sector. Anyway, the government is trying to do something about this, and as usual, Joko has the gem.
I do. Starting from next month, the government will phase in an automatic enrolment scheme, which will put all workers into a workplace pension. That's if they're aged between 22 and the state pension age, earn at least £8,105 a year, and are not already in a scheme which meets the minimum standards. Employees can opt out, but saving in a pension will be the new default setting for anyone who doesn't express a choice. Eventually, the automatic level of contributions will be at least 8% of the individual's qualifying earnings. This includes 3%, which comes from the employer. Speaking on a visit to a supermarket today, Pension Secretary Ian Duncan-Smith said the scheme was vital.
Britain has a terrible savings culture. As all the reports, even the most recent ones, say, actually saving in pension is beginning to fall. 11 million people simply don't save enough for their retirement. This is an opportunity to give people a slow and easy way to save that guarantees them a decent income in retirement. That's a vital, important ingredient in our lives. Remember, we spend a lot of years when we're not working, and we need to make sure our income before we retire is set. And that's the perfect bit. And following that will be the single-tier pension, which means that everything you save goes towards your future, not towards the government's future.
Ian Duncan-Smith, the Welfare Secretary, with us now his colleague, Pensions Minister, Lib Dem MP, Steve Webb. Welcome back, Mr Webb, to the Daily Politics. Now, the bottom tenth of earners, the lowest paid people in the country, but they're in work, but they're the low paid, their pay between 2010 and 2011, it didn't rise. It rose. The figures say 0.1%, so I think we can agree it didn't rise at all. Food prices at that time went up 35%. Utility bills went up 20%. Things they all have to pay. There's no choice on that. Got to put food on the table and keep the place warm. And now you're going to take another 4% off their income. How does that work?
Well, the first thing to say is that this is a voluntary scheme. So if somebody's really strapped for cash, thinks pension saving isn't for them, they can opt out. But what we know is that most people know they need a pension, but it's too difficult, too complicated. And what this scheme does is the employer chooses a scheme and the employer puts some money in. And I had to smile. Behind Ian Duncan-Smith was a sign that said, buy one, get one free. And that's more or less how this scheme works. You put your 4 in, and that turns into 8 because of what the government puts in and what the employer puts in.
Right, but I bet you what the small employer is going to say to these people is, well, I'm having to put an extra 3% in so you can say goodbye to any pay rise next year.
And we've thought about the small firms.
So it's not get one small, one free, one free, is it?
So we thought about the small firms, and one option was to exclude them altogether. But of course, just because you work for a small firm doesn't mean you should have to retire poor. So instead, what we've done is try to ease the burden on the small firms. They don't have to come in for several years, but it's been done very gradually to make the transition. But what is the alternative, as we see it?
I understand, but a lot of people who already don't take home much will just see this as another tax. In a sense, it's another 4% on income tax. Is it 4% of everything they earn?
4% above a floor of about 5,500.
Right, and so it's a lower floor than when income tax clicks in now.
Exactly, that's right. So what we're trying to do, obviously, to help the lower earners is raise the income tax threshold that you mentioned, so that will help the very people you're talking about. We're bringing this 4% in over 4 or 5 years, so it's not all at once. And the evidence when this has been done around the world is it's actually quite popular. People say, this was the phrase I heard this morning at the supermarket was, this was the nudge I needed. I knew I needed a pension and you've helped fix it for me.
I'll bring you in a second, Toby. But, you know, we looked at some figures here. If you're a 50-year-old earning about just over £20,000, after 16 years of paying into this scheme, with 4% of your income being taken away every year, you're left with an income at the age of 66 when you retire, which I think is when they will retire now, it'll be a year more than now. Your pension is £940 a year. £940 a year.
And if you start pension saving at 50, not 22, those are the sorts of figures you'll get. So one of the beauties of this scheme is it gets young people in, gets them started early at a minimum level, and then as they get older, they can build on that. So we've got to get people in earlier than we have in the past.
But hand on heart, could you look at a 50-year-old today given the figures. I mean, it comes out at 18 quid a week, on top of the state pension they get, but it's a pittance. Could you really look at a 50-year-old and say, this is what you should do?
Absolutely, because of the employer contribution. If they invest it in an ISA or something, fine, but they don't get the employer contribution. So the money is immediately doubled through the tax relief from the employer.
Totally.
It's the employer contribution bit that slightly alarms me. I mean, there's no question that in the long haul, this will increase the burden on small businesses, and that runs slightly counter to the post-reshuffle mood music that the coalition is now going to make life a bit easier for small businesses. And I wondered if this was a Lib Dem pound of flesh extracted from Michael Fallon in return for implementing some of the Beercroft reforms.
He's not got a lot of flesh, Michael Fallon.
The funny thing about this is it's been talked about, Adair Turner came up with the idea a decade ago, Labour legislated, the coalition's implemented it. And with pensions, you want all party support. You don't want faffing around one party, another party. You want consistency, and all the major parties are behind this, because we don't have an alternative, really. People are going to retire in poverty if we don't do it.
So you won't be bragging in the next general election campaign that this was a concession the Lib Dems won out of the nasty
Not
party.
a concession. I shall certainly say I'm proud to be associated with this as a Lib Dem.
But are you worried that, I mean, these are tough times for most people, except for the very rich. And they're particularly tough times for people at the lower end of the income scale. For the figures I've given, that their income isn't going up by very much, if at all, but things they have to spend money on. These are not treats or discretionary spending. They have got to pay utility bills. They've got to put food on the table. That because of that, people will say, I'm going to opt out of this. I cannot afford at the moment to lose another 4% of my income.
And we recognise some people will opt out, and we think maybe up to about a third. But even at that rate, between 6 and 9 million people will be getting into pensions for the first time. Think of another government policy that helps 6 to 9 million people retire on a better standard of living. I think it's great.
If you got in at the age of, say, 25, and I think that's tough. I mean, certainly when I was 25, which is almost 10 years ago now, when I was 25, I didn't think about a pension.
No.
So it's going to be quite hard even to get it to. I mean, I wanted the 4% to go and spend it. But if you went in at 25 and you got your 3, your 4 and your 1 on tax relief, what kind of pension would you end up with?
So if you're going to be on a modest wage, say you're on 15,000 or something, then the state pension plus this pension is going to replace most of that. So your living standard's going to be about the same. If you're on average earnings, you need to do more than this minimum, clearly. You do. But the challenge is to get people in the first place. And if we can do that, then we can build on it. All right.
And on the state pensions moving to a flat rate, I think it's going to be 140
That's the sort of figure we're talking about.
Right. Are we right? We see reports that the Prime Minister, who called this, quote, the best thing since sliced bread, now seems to be less enthusiastic. Is it going to be dropped? Is it going to be amended?
No, it's going ahead. We said a white paper in the autumn, which we will publish. I've talked to the Prime Minister about it, talked to the Chancellor about it. It's going to happen. And it's the foundation for what we're talking about today. Get the pension up to a decent level, and then when you save, you're better off as a result. All right.
And the other thing that we're seeing is that because the deficit reduction is not quite going as quickly as the coalition said it would, and you might not meet the debt target of debt falling as a percentage of GDP by 2015-16. The Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Apology, he said that no Lib Dem, there would be no further welfare cuts that we would accept. He said that in April. But yesterday he said that more cuts were possible. Where are we? Where are the Lib Dems?
Sure. I mean, we've always taken the view that cuts have had to be made across the board, but our priority has been protecting the most vulnerable. So in some of the benefit changes that have happened, we've tried to ring-fence the most vulnerable, and that will always be the way that we approach future discussions about spending reductions.
But you're not ruling out further cuts in the welfare budget?
Welfare, as with every other spending department, is in the mix, but we're going to try and protect the vulnerable.
All right.